There's something quietly unsettling about a place the whole world once talked about, and then simply stopped. No goodbye, no ceremony. Just silence where there used to be noise, and weeds where there used to be people. These aren't obscure towns nobody ever heard of. These are places people built fortunes in, planned vacations around, and read about in newspapers from New York to London. And now most people under 40 have never heard of them. These are the 15 forgotten places in America that used to be world famous. Number 15, Bodie, California. Bodie doesn't announce itself. You drive miles of dusty road through nothing, no signs, no cell signal, no gas stations, and then suddenly there it is. Over 100 wooden buildings, still standing, exactly as they were left. Dishes still on the tables, bottles still on the bar, a child's shoe sitting by a doorway, like the owner just stepped out. In its prime, Bodie was terrifying in the best way. Gold was discovered here in 1859, and by 1879, the population had ballooned to nearly 10,000 people. It had 65 saloons along a mile-long main street, a Wells Fargo bank, 4 volunteer fire companies, daily newspapers, and a jail that was reportedly never empty. Shootings and brawls were so common that one local paper ran the headline, "No man was killed in Bodie last night," as genuine news, because it was actually newsworthy when that happened. One traveler described Bodie as a sea of sin lashed by the tempest of lust and passion. And people came anyway, because gold doesn't really care about your reputation. By 1881, the mines started slowing down. The get-rich-quick crowd drifted toward Tombstone and Butte, wherever the next rumor of a strike was circulating. 2 major fires, in 1892 and 1932, wiped out most of what remained. The last mine closed in 1942 under a wartime order, halting all non-essential gold operations. At that point, only a handful of people were left. Today, California's state park system keeps Bodie in what they call arrested decay, letting it rot naturally without tearing anything down. Over 200,000 people visit every year to walk the empty streets of a place that once made national headlines daily. Number 14, the Salton Riviera, California. At its peak in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the so-called Salton Riviera was pulling in 1.5 million visitors annually, more than Yosemite National Park was seeing at the time. Developers weren't understating it when they called it the miracle in the desert and Palm Springs with water. For a while, it was exactly that. The Salton Sea was born by accident in 1905, when Colorado River flooding breached an irrigation canal and poured into California's Salton Basin for 18 straight months. What remained was California's largest lake, 15 miles wide and 35 miles long. Developers moved in quickly. By the late 1950s, resorts, yacht clubs, hotels, marinas, and golf courses lined the shores. Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, the Beach Boys, Dean Martin, and Jerry Lewis all made appearances. The North Shore Beach and Yacht Club, which opened in 1959, was the largest marina in all of Southern California. Then the water started killing things. The Salton Sea has no natural outlet. Agricultural runoff, pesticides, and salts flow in, and nothing flows out except through evaporation. The lake has no drainage. By the 1970s, tropical storms flooded the resort communities along the shore. Fish died by the millions, their carcasses washing up on beaches. The smell, officially described by the U.S. Geological Survey as objectionable, noxious, and pervasive, drove visitors away almost overnight. Today, Bombay Beach, once the crown jewel of the Salton Riviera, has around 200 residents. The shoreline is carpeted in the crushed bones of dead fish. Rusted marinas sit half-submerged. An eclectic art scene has moved into the ruins. Sculptors and photographers who've turned the apocalyptic landscape into something resembling a gallery. Most people still can't get past the smell. Number 13, Centralia, Pennsylvania. In May 1962, the Centralia Borough Council hired 5 volunteer firefighters to clean up the town's garbage dump before Memorial Day. Standard procedure. They'd done it before. They set the trash on fire, let it burn, and figured that was that. This time, something went wrong. The fire found its way through an unsealed gap in the landfill wall and into the abandoned coal mines beneath the town. It has been burning every single day since, for over 60 years now. Experts estimate there is enough coal under Centralia to fuel the fire for another 250 years. Centralia had been a mining community since the mid-1800s, built on some of the richest anthracite coal deposits in the United States. By the early 1900s, it had over 2,500 residents. By 1960, the population had already been declining for years as the coal industry contracted nationwide. The mine fire was, as one historian put it, a sudden and dramatic disaster piled onto an advancing economic one. For years, residents tried to ignore it. Then the symptoms started. Sulfurous fumes seeping into basements, hot steam rising from cracks in the pavement, snow melting on sidewalks in December when temperatures were well below freezing. In 1981, 12-year-old Todd Domboski was playing in his grandmother's backyard when the ground gave way and swallowed him whole. He grabbed exposed tree roots and held on until his cousin reached him. That incident ended any pretense that the situation was manageable. Congress eventually allocated over $42 million to relocate residents. Pennsylvania invoked eminent domain on all properties in 1992. The zip code was revoked in 2002. Today, fewer than 5 people remain, holdouts who negotiated the right to stay until they die. Smoke still rises from the ground on cold mornings. Centralia also, indirectly, inspired the 2006 horror film Silent Hill. That tracks. Number 12. Rhyolite, Nevada. A 2-man mining camp in January 1905. A town of 1,200 people by March. A full city of 10,000 by 1907. With electric lights, running water, telephones, a stock exchange, a hospital, an opera house, and 3 competing railroad lines. By 1920, 14 people. Rhyolite is the gold rush ghost town that most people have never heard of. Despite being one of the most photographed abandoned places in the entire American West, it sits just outside Death Valley, near the Nevada-California border, and its ruins are genuinely remarkable. The shell of a 3-story bank building with marble floors and mahogany fittings, a restored train depot built in the Spanish style, and a 3-room house constructed almost entirely from 50,000 empty glass bottles. Prospectors Frank Shorty Harris and Ernest Cross found gold in the Bullfrog Hills in 1904. Thousands arrived within months. Industrialist Charles Schwab bought the Montgomery Shoshone mine in 1906 and invested heavily in the town's infrastructure. Rhyolite had schools, newspapers, restaurants, a full red light district, and even its own stock exchange. Then the ore ran out. A financial panic hit in 1907. The mine was reappraised and found to be dramatically overvalued. Workers left, businesses closed, the railroad stopped running, and Rhyolite, which had taken just a few years to build into something genuinely impressive, collapsed almost as fast. Harris himself later said, "I've seen many gold rushes in my time that were Hummers, but nothing like that stampede." The boom barely lasted a decade. Today, the site is managed by the Bureau of Land Management. Just below the ruins sits the Goldwell Open Air Museum, featuring a plaster recreation of The Last Supper that Belgian artist Albert Sukalski installed in 1984. It's a surreal sight, a Renaissance masterpiece in the Nevada desert, next to the ruins of a city that lasted 15 years. Number 11. Cairo, Illinois. In the mid-1800s, serious people were seriously suggesting that Cairo, Illinois, should become the capital of the United States. That is not a joke. Cairo sat at the exact confluence of the Ohio River and the Mississippi, and that geography seemed to guarantee greatness. 2 of the continent's most important rivers, meeting at a single town. That's a trade hub by definition. Early investors compared it favorably to St. Louis, Cincinnati, and Louisville. Charles Dickens visited in 1842 and called it a dismal swamp. He wasn't entirely wrong, but he was early. By the mid-1800s, Cairo was booming, a vital steamboat port that shipped 6 million pounds of cotton and wool in 1859 alone. During the Civil War, General Ulysses Grant made Cairo his headquarters for the Western campaigns, and the city became a major Union supply center. At the height of its prosperity, Cairo's post office was the third busiest in the entire United States. Then the bridges came. A railroad bridge across the Ohio in 1889. Another at Thebes crossing the Mississippi in 1905. Automobile bridges in 1929 and 1937. Each one rerouted traffic that used to stop in Cairo straight past it. The ferry industry, which had been ferrying nearly 250,000 railroad cars across the rivers in a single 6-month stretch, collapsed entirely. Jobs vanished. Population followed. Then came the racial conflicts, violent and sustained through the mid-20th century, that accelerated Cairo's collapse. Businesses shuttered permanently. People relocated to cities with jobs and futures. The population peaked at 15,203 in 1920. By 2020, it was 1,733, an 89% loss over a century. Grand Victorian buildings sit next to empty lots. The historic Gem Theater still stands, barely. Most of the downtown is boarded up and slowly giving way to kudzu. Cairo is technically still alive, but not by much. Number 10. Michigan Central Station, Detroit. When Michigan Central Station opened in December 1913, it was the tallest railroad station in the world. Designed by the same architectural firms that built New York's Grand Central Terminal, it rose 18 stories above Detroit's Corktown, a Beaux-Arts train depot faced in limestone and built to last. At its peak during the 2 World Wars, more than 4,000 passengers passed through daily, and over 200 trains departed every morning. Some called it Detroit's Ellis Island, the first grand building millions of immigrants encountered when they arrived to work in the booming auto industry. Then, on January 5, 1988, the last Amtrak train pulled out of the station, bound for Chicago. The doors closed, and for the next 36 years, the building sat empty. The decline was slow and then devastating. Rail travel had been losing ground to cars and planes since the 1950s. The station's location, away from downtown in a neighborhood that had suffered alongside the rest of Detroit's industrial decline, made it economically unviable. Efforts to redevelop it as a casino, a police headquarters, or a customs center all failed. The company that owned it went bankrupt. Scrappers stripped everything movable. Windows shattered. Graffiti covered the walls. And somehow, all that decay made Michigan Central more famous than it had ever been when trains were running. Photographers came from around the world. Michael Bay used it as a backdrop in Transformers. The image of this enormous, crumbling palace became the defining symbol of Detroit's long economic collapse. In 2018, Ford Motor Company bought the station. On June 6, 2024, it reopened with a concert headlined by Diana Ross, Jack White, and Eminem. The restoration cost roughly $950 million. It took a collapsed economy, 36 years of ruin, and nearly $1 billion to bring it back. Number 9. Kennecott, Alaska. Deep inside Wrangell St. Elias National Park, the largest national park in the United States, bigger than the entire country of Switzerland, a cluster of massive red mill buildings clings to a mountainside above a glacier. To reach them, you take a 60-mile dirt road that most rental car companies explicitly forbid you from driving, through a valley that has no cell service and no services of any kind. This is Kennecott. And for a brief period in the early 20th century, it was the most productive copper mining operation on Earth. The copper deposits in Alaska's Wrangell Mountains were discovered in 1900. Within a few years, a consortium including the Guggenheim family and J.P. Morgan had built not just a mine, but a complete company town from scratch. At 2,000 feet elevation, in one of the most remote and unforgiving corners of the continent. To connect the mine to a port, they constructed a 196-mile railroad through active glaciers and mountain passes. They built a processing mill, housing, a hospital, a school, and a power plant. All of it in the Alaskan wilderness, because the copper was worth it. From 1903 to 1938, Kennecott produced roughly $200 million worth of copper. When the ore ran out in 1938, the company gave workers a day's notice and walked away. Every piece of machinery, every tool, every piece of furniture was simply left in place. The town was locked and abandoned, as if it had never existed. Today, the National Park Service manages the site. The buildings are being preserved, though some are actively collapsing. The view from the old mill, red industrial ruins set against glaciers, and peaks rising behind them, is one of the more genuinely surreal things you'll encounter anywhere in America. Number 8. Picher, Oklahoma. In 1918, the discovery of lead and zinc deposits in the corner of northeastern Oklahoma set off one of the most intense mining booms in American history. By the 1920s, Picher, Oklahoma, was producing roughly half of all the lead and zinc that went into American military operations in World War I, the metals used in bullets, artillery shells, and armor plating. The town grew to 14,000 people. Nobody thought much about what the mining was doing to the land underneath, or to the people living on it. Decades of extraction left behind massive piles of chat, toxic mining waste that towered over the town like gray mountains. The chat contained heavy concentrations of lead, cadmium, and zinc. The dust blew through neighborhoods and playgrounds. Children climbed and played on the chat piles without anyone stopping them. The groundwater was contaminated. Repeated studies found that Picher's children had severely elevated blood lead levels, and lead poisoning at those concentrations causes permanent neurological damage. By 2009, the federal government had bought out nearly all remaining residents, and the town was officially dissolved, legally erased from the map. The EPA had long since declared the area one of the most toxic Superfund sites in the United States. The chat piles are still there. They haven't gone anywhere. They rise above empty lots where houses once stood, and nature is slowly, quietly reclaiming the streets. The town that supplied the metals for American military victories in 2 world wars is now one of the most contaminated places in the country. Number 7, Glenrio, Texas/New Mexico. Route 66 made Glenrio, and when Route 66 died, it took Glenrio along with it. The town sits exactly on the Texas-New Mexico border, so precisely that the state line runs right down the middle of it, splitting the main street in two. This wasn't accidental. Texas was dry on Sundays, so the bars and liquor stores operated on the New Mexico side of the line. New Mexico had higher gas taxes, so the fuel was cheaper on the Texas side. Glenrio worked both angles simultaneously, and travelers on Route 66, the main highway connecting Chicago to Los Angeles throughout the mid-20th century, stopped there in large numbers. The first motel in Texas stood here. In 1975, Interstate 40 bypassed Glenrio entirely. Traffic dried up almost overnight. The diner, the bar, the gas stations, gone within a few years. The people moved to Amarillo, Albuquerque, wherever there was still an economic reason to be. Today, Glenrio is a National Historic District. The buildings are still standing, a row of weathered motels, an old gas station, a cafe with hand-painted signs advertising prices that haven't been current since the early 1970s. It is completely, thoroughly silent. The interstate hums somewhere to the south. Nothing stops anymore. Number 6, Cahaba, Alabama. Cahaba has the rare distinction of having been the capital of the entire state of Alabama, and then being so thoroughly forgotten that most Alabamans today couldn't tell you where it was, or that it existed at all. It was founded in 1820 at the confluence of the Alabama and Cahaba rivers, chosen as the state capital because of its river access and its apparent potential for commerce. Investors believed the rivers would make it a thriving center of trade. For a brief period, they were right. The town grew into a functioning capital. Then the floods started. The Alabama River rose again and again, inundating the low-lying town. By 1826, the state government had relocated to Tuscaloosa. Cahaba continued as a commercial town and actually experienced a period of real growth in the 1840s and 1850s. Then, the Civil War arrived. The town was converted into a Confederate prisoner of war camp. When the war ended, the economic collapse hit hard, and the floods that had never stopped finally finished the job. By 1900, the town was empty. Today, Old Cahaba Archaeological Park preserves the site. Visitors walk trails through what was once a functioning city and find almost nothing visible above ground. Moss-covered grave markers, brick foundations poking through the soil, rusted iron fence posts, and a century's worth of oak and sweet gum growing over everything. Alabama's first state capital is now a quiet, beautiful forest with a past most visitors don't know about. Number 5. Times Beach, Missouri. In 1972, a waste oil hauler named Russell Bliss was hired to spray oil on the unpaved roads of Times Beach, Missouri, to keep the dust under control. It was a common, inexpensive solution at the time. He sprayed it on roads. He sprayed it in horse arenas. He sprayed it in areas where children played. The oil was laced with dioxin, a byproduct of industrial chemical manufacturing and one of the most toxic substances known to science. Times Beach had been a modest river resort since the 1920s. By the post-war years, a year-round community of about 2,000 residents who had no idea what had been sprayed on their roads. In December 1982, the EPA confirmed widespread dioxin contamination throughout the town. That same week, with a kind of terrible timing, the Merrimack River flooded, spreading the already present contamination further across the area. Within months, the federal government announced a complete buyout of every home and business in Times Beach. Every resident was relocated. By 1985, the town no longer existed. It became the largest civilian evacuation due to a chemical emergency in American history at that point. The land was eventually remediated over many years, and the site was converted into Route 66 State Park in 1999. The visitor center sits inside what used to be a roadhouse. Most people walking through have no idea they're standing in a neighborhood that was erased. Number 4, North Brother Island, New York City. In the middle of the East River, situated between the Bronx and Rikers Island, there's an island that almost no New Yorker knows about, even though it sits in full view of millions of people every single day. North Brother Island was home to Riverside Hospital, established in 1885 as a quarantine facility for patients with contagious diseases. Its most famous, and most involuntary, resident was Mary Mallon, known to history as Typhoid Mary. She was the first identified asymptomatic carrier of typhoid fever in the United States. She spent the last 23 years of her life on the island, dying there in 1938. After Riverside Hospital closed in 1943, the island served a very different purpose. From the early 1950s through 1963, it housed a rehabilitation program for young heroin addicts. The program closed in 1963 amid reports of abuse and neglect, and the island was simply abandoned. Today, North Brother Island is a bird sanctuary managed by the city. The hospital buildings, the nurses' quarters, the staff residences, all of it is still standing, but completely engulfed by vegetation. Vines have wrapped the structures so thoroughly that walls are barely visible. Trees grow up through collapsed floors. Roofs have fallen inward. The whole island has been reclaimed by nature in a way that takes 60 years of uninterrupted growth to achieve. Occasional boat tours pass close to the shoreline, and from the water you can make out the shapes of buildings beneath the green. A ghost, a quarter mile from one of the most populated cities on Earth. Number 3. Elkmont, Tennessee. In the 1920s and 1930s, Elkmont was one of the most fashionable retreat destinations in the American South. Located in what is now Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee, it was home to the Wonderland Club, private summer resort where well-to-do families from Knoxville built personal cottages along a cool mountain creek. The porches filled up every summer. The air smelled of wood smoke and rhododendron. Children grew up in those cottages and brought their own children back years later. Access to Elkmont came via the Little River Railroad, originally built to log the Smokies. Once the timber was stripped, the railroad pivoted to tourism, and Elkmont became the resort at the end of the line, remote enough to feel like an escape, accessible enough to actually reach. When the federal government established Great Smoky Mountains National Park in the 1930s, it acquired the land but allowed the original cottage owners to hold lifetime leases. For decades, families kept returning every summer, generation after generation. By the 1990s, those leases had all expired, and the National Park Service declined to renew them. The Wonderland Hotel was demolished in 2005. A small number of cottages are being preserved by the Park Service. The rest are being left to collapse naturally, their porches rotting, their walls caving inward, their gardens overgrown. Elkmont isn't the wreckage of a mining boom or an environmental disaster. It's the quiet, melancholy wreckage of a summer tradition that was ended by bureaucratic paperwork. It's somehow sadder for it. Number 2. Cahokia Mounds, Illinois. In the year 1100 AD, there was a city in what is now southern Illinois that was larger than London, larger than Paris, one of the largest cities on Earth, in fact, with a population between 15,000 and 20,000 people, covering 6 square miles and featuring a central pyramid, Monk's Mound, that still stands 100 feet tall today, larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Almost nobody knows it existed. The city we now call Cahokia flourished from roughly 1050 to 1350 CE, built by the Mississippian peoples along the floodplain across the river from what is now St. Louis. Its original name has been completely lost. The name Cahokia comes from a tribe that lived nearby in the 1600s, centuries after the city was already abandoned. At its height, the city had 120 earthen mounds, a central plaza, a solar calendar built from wooden posts, trade networks stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, and urban planning so deliberate that archaeologists can trace the whole layout from a single organized scheme. University of Illinois anthropologist Thomas Emerson put it plainly. It's a total orphan, a lost city in every sense. By around 1350, Cahokia had been abandoned. Exactly why remains uncertain. Flooding, drought, resource depletion, the kind of slow unraveling that happens when a city outgrows its ability to sustain itself. The people dispersed. The wooden structures rotted. The mounds remained, but without anyone to explain what they were, later European settlers assumed they were natural hills. Today, Cahokia Mounds is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of only 26 in the United States, sitting 8 miles from St. Louis, right beside Interstate 55. About 300,000 people visit each year. The Eiffel Tower sees 7 million. Number 1, Bombay Beach, California. We started this list in California, and we'll end it there, specifically at Bombay Beach, a place that may best capture what it means to go from world famous to world forgotten, and somehow come out the other side as something worth paying attention to again. In the late 1950s, Bombay Beach was the hottest beach town in Southern California. Located on the eastern shore of the Salton Sea, it sat 223 feet below sea level, the lowest incorporated community in the United States, a buoyancy that speedboat racers loved. The ski-in bar was packed on weekends, its walls covered floor to ceiling in signed dollar bills, a tradition started by vacationers in the 1950s. Then the Salton Sea began its long, slow death. The water turned brackish, then toxic. The fish died. The smell arrived. Floods in the 1970s and 1980s inundated large portions of the community. The celebrity visitors stopped coming. The resort developers disappeared, and Bombay Beach became the most visible ruin of the Salton Riviera's complete collapse. Today, around 200 people live in Bombay Beach. The streets are a grid of crumbling houses, flooded lots, a abandoned trailers, and the occasional functioning home. Starting around 2011, artists began arriving, drawn by the apocalyptic scenery and the cheap desert land. Sculptures appear in vacant lots, murals cover old walls, an annual arts festival draws crowds from Los Angeles who camp in the desert for a weekend and photograph the decay. There's something almost poetic about it. A town built on glamour and leisure, now drawing people precisely because of its spectacular, sun-bleached ruin. The Salton Sea is still shrinking, the air quality is still dangerous, and the fish are long gone. But Bombay Beach, the lowest community in America, refuses to completely disappear. It just found a different reason to exist. Every place on this list was, at some point, the kind of place people talked about. They put it on maps, wrote about it in newspapers, built railroads to reach it, told their friends to visit, and then, for one reason or another, a mine ran dry, a road moved, a fire started underground and never stopped. The world simply moved on. The places stayed. The attention didn't. What's strange is how complete the forgetting can be. A city larger than London in 1100, sitting 8 miles from St. Louis. A resort that outdrew Yosemite, now smelling of dead fish. A town once considered for the national capital, now boarded up. These weren't footnotes, they were the main story. For a while. If this video was worth your time, like and subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.